This episode covers the extraordinary events leading up to the 1924 British general election, when a foreign power, Communist Russia, attempted to change the result in their favour and start a popular uprising which would turn the country, with the help of the Labour Party, into an autocratic Stalinist state. By the end of the year, a political scandal had broken out, which would lead to the fall of the minority Labour government and the demise of the old Liberal Party. This is the scandal of the Zinoviev letter. In 1924, the world seemed to be enjoying genuine peace after the trauma of the previous few years. King George V opened the British Empire Exhibition in London in April, and the Sunday Express changed the cultural landscape in November by publishing the first crossword puzzle. Paris held the Summer Olympics, but there were worrying signs on the horizon. In Chicago, a former Brooklyn bouncer called Al Capone was starting to cement his control of the underworld. In Germany, an obscure political activist called Adolf Hitler had just been released from Landsberg prison after 9 months of a 5-year sentence, where he penned his book Mein Kampf. Up until the dawn of the 20th century, Parliament had been dominated by the Liberals and the Conservatives. No other parties had ever held office in the last 100 years. But then it all changed when the Labour Party was formed in 1900, after the decision in a controversial court case to make trade unions liable for industrial disputes. In the election of that year, they were able to secure 29 parliamentary seats. They never looked back, as they ate repeatedly into the Liberal majority in each subsequent election. In 1906, the Liberals formed a secret pact with Labour, in which they would not fight each other's safe constituencies, and the Liberals were able to win a huge majority. In January 1924, the Labour Party, led by Ramsay MacDonald, won the general election and formed a government in Britain for the first time. Labour had only been in existence for 24 years, and the traditional political hierarchy was incensed that it was led not by a proper gentleman, but the illegitimate son of some house servant who could not afford fine porcelain in number 10. The Liberals who had agreed to support the government were not particularly happy with this prospect. It was a minority administration, and liable to fall if the Conservatives and Liberals joined forces against it. The Labour cabinet used its executive powers to offer official recognition of the Soviet Union in February. It also proposed to lend it money and to open up trade, but Parliament mostly obstructed these measures. By the autumn, the government had suffered a defeat in the House of Commons on a motion of no confidence proposed by the Liberals, who had until then supported the continuation of the minority government while also blocking most of its policy initiatives. Instead of resigning, MacDonald dissolved Parliament and a general election was called. The cause of the defeat had been the Cabinet's decision to drop the prosecution in August of Communist editor John Campbell under the Incitement to Mutiny Act 1797 for publication of an open letter in the Workers' Weekly calling on soldiers to let it be known that neither in the class war nor in a military war will you turn your guns on your fellow workers, but instead will line up with your fellow workers in an attack upon the exploiters and capitalists, and will use your arms on the side of your own class. 4 days before the end of the short election campaign, dated the 15th September, a letter apparently sent to the Communist Party of Great Britain by Grigory Zinoviev, President of the Communist International, was received by the Secret Intelligence Service The letter suggested that a Labour government would continue its plans to normalise ties with the Soviet Union. This would result in them profiteering economically, as well as being able to spread communist influence, not only within Great Britain, but the wider empire. This would result in a communist revolution by the working classes, and amongst the military. The letter was addressed to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain, purporting to have originated from Zinoviev in Russia, who was head of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, or Comintern as it was known. It predicted that the Labour government's attempted normalisation of Britain's diplomatic and economic relations with the Soviet Union would not only profit the latter, but also stir the British proletariat to revolutionary actions and allow Soviet influence over the country. One particularly damaging section of this letter read,
"A settlement of relations between the two countries will assist in the revolutionizing of the international and British proletariat, not less than a successful rising in any of the working districts of England, as the establishment of close contacts between the British and the Russian proletariat. The exchange of delegations and workers will make it possible for us to extend and develop the propaganda of ideas of Leninism in England and the colonies."
Publicly, the letter was widely accepted as genuine by the security services, although it is believed that privately there were reservations about its origin. This did not stop the Foreign Office from deciding to publish the letter, against the wishes of the Prime Minister, in the Times newspaper a few days before the general election. The Daily Mail received 2 copies of the letter and decided to publish it on the 25th of October. The editor of the Daily Mail also gave the letter to other parts of the British right-wing press. This essentially distributed misinformation to the general population, suggesting that the Labour government was supportive of communism. The letter rankled at a sensitive time in relations between Britain and the Soviet Union, owing to vehement conservative opposition to the parliamentary ratification of the Anglo-Soviet trade agreement, which had been ratified in August. The publication of the letter was severely embarrassing to Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald and his Labour Party. Although they faced a high likelihood of losing office, MacDonald had not given up hope of winning the campaign. Following the letter's publication, any chance of a victory was dashed, as the spectre of internal unrest, and the government oblivious to, or even complicit in, the alleged peril from Russia dominated the headlines and the public's attention. MacDonald's attempts to cast doubt on the authenticity of the letter were in vain. Hampered by the document's widespread acceptance among government officials, he told his cabinet that he felt like a man sewn in a sack and thrown into the sea. Zinoviev immediately refuted the claims that he was responsible for writing the letter. The Comintern and the Soviet government strongly and consistently denied the authenticity of the document. Grigory Zinoviev issued a denial on the 27th of October, 2 days before the election, which was finally published in English in the December issue of the magazine The Communist Review, well after the MacDonald government had already fallen. Zinoviev issued this statement.
"The letter of the 15th of September 1924, which has been attributed to me, is from the first to the last word a forgery. Let us take the heading. The organization of which I am the president never mentions itself officially as the Executive Committee of the Third Communist International. The official name is the Executive Committee of the Communist International. Equally incorrect is the signature. The chairman of the Presidium. The forger has shown himself to be very stupid in his choice of the date. On the 15th of September 1924, I was taking a holiday in Kozlovich, and therefore could not have signed any official letter."
It is not difficult to understand why some of the leaders of the liberal-conservative bloc had recourse to such methods as the forging of documents. Apparently they seriously thought they would be able, at the last minute before the election, to create confusion in the ranks of those electors who sincerely sympathised with the treaty between England and the Soviet Union. It is much more difficult to understand why the English Foreign Office, which was still under the control of the Prime Minister, MacDonald, did not refrain from making use of such a blatant forgery. The Conservatives decisively won the October election, ending the country's first ever Labour government. After they formed a government with Stanley Baldwin as Prime Minister, a cabinet committee investigated the letter and concluded that it was genuine. The Conservative government did not undertake any further investigation, despite continuing suggestions that the letter was forged. In November, Parliament cancelled the trade agreement with the Soviet Union. Around this time, MI5 determined secretly that the letter was beyond question a forgery. In order to protect its reputation and to keep the myth of Labour's acquiescence to the Soviet Union alive, it did not inform the rest of the government, which continued to treat it as genuine. After successfully weathering all the early contradictions in Soviet diplomacy, Britain gave up when the going was about to become much easier, and it gave up largely because the two middle-class parties suddenly perceived that their short-term electoral advantage was best served by a violent anti-Bolshevik campaign. The letter had been widely taken to be authentic when it was published, and for some time afterwards, but historians now agree it was a forgery. The letter perhaps aided the Conservative Party by hastening the ongoing collapse of the Liberal Party vote, which, in turn, produced a Conservative landslide. It has been argued that the letter's most important impact was on the mindset of Labour Party members, who for years afterwards blamed foul play for their defeat, thereby misunderstanding the political forces at work and postponing what was regarded as necessary reforms within their own ranks. The letter is now widely accepted to be a forgery, with investigations into its origins taking place up until the end of the 1990s. It is also generally agreed that the letter had little immediate impact on the Labour vote, which not only held up, but, in fact, increased slightly in terms of its share of the popular vote, although the main reason for this uptick was that the party fielded candidates in 87 more constituencies than it had in the previous election. The letter helped propel the Conservatives to a large parliamentary majority by allowing them to poach voters frightened by the threat of communism. It was claimed that it had been intercepted by British intelligence in Riga and passed to London. Even if it was genuine, it was no different from other communications sent by Moscow to London. The Daily Mail only printed the Zinoviev letter once it got a confirmatory message from Conservative Central Office, who had probably received a copy through its contacts in MI5. To this day, it is claimed the Labour Party has always viewed MI5 with suspicion for denying them a chance to stay in power. So, if it was a forgery, who was responsible? It has been suggested that two members of a Russian monarchist organisation called the Brotherhood of St. George composed the document in Berlin. Irina Belograd, the widow of Alexis Belograd, one of the two men said to have written the document, stated that she had witnessed the forgery as it was performed. She said that her husband had drafted the letter after fellow émigré Alexander Gumansky told him that a request to forge the letter had come from a person in authority in London. Gumansky and Belograd were later sentenced to death in absentia by a Soviet court. Bellegarde was later forced to work during the Second World War for the Russian section of the Abwehr, German military intelligence in Berlin. Some evidence suggests that he was the highly effective British double agent, known as Outcast. He had been an important source on Soviet matters for MI6 since the First World War, raising the possibility that he already had deep links to British intelligence when involved in the fabrication of the Zinoviev letter. The forgers appear to have studied Bolshevik documents and signatures extensively before creating the letter to undermine the Soviet regime's relations with the United Kingdom. The Foreign Office had received the forgery on the 10th of October, days before the defeat of the MacDonald government on the no-confidence vote initiated by the Liberals. Despite the dubious nature of the document, wheels were set in motion for its publication, with members of the Conservative Party combining with Foreign Office officials in what could only be described as a conspiracy. Whilst there has been no definitive proof of where the letter originated from, the original has never been found. It is accepted that if the security services weren't involved in producing the letter, then they were at least responsible for the narrative that it was authentic, whilst internally having reservations. The publication of the letter was unlikely to have impacted the result of the 1924 general election, but would have generally further damaged the reputation of the Labour Party. In 2017, the British government claimed that it had lost a file on the Zinoviev letter scandal. The government added that they were unable to determine whether copies of the material had ever been made. In 1936, Grigory Zinoviev was arrested during the Great Stalinist Purge and accused of treason. After a show trial with some fellow accused, he was found guilty. In August, he was sentenced to death and was subsequently shot in the cellars of Lubyanka prison in Moscow.